Thanksgiving Massacre. Chapter 1: The First Victim. A cold autumn wind swept through the quaint streets of Harverton, sending fallen leaves skittering across the sidewalks. It was 2 days before Thanksgiving, and the small town was buzzing with holiday preparations. At Harverton High School, students soaked up the festive spirit, eagerly awaiting the coming break. In her classroom, English teacher Kate Burrows smiled as she erased the notes from her last class of the day. At 32, with long auburn hair and kind green eyes, Kate was beloved by staff and students alike. She often volunteered for extracurricular activities, heading the poetry club and organizing the spring musical. As Kate gathered her things to leave, her phone buzzed. It was a text from her husband Tyler reminding her to pick up ingredients for their Thanksgiving meal. Kate smiled wistfully, knowing this would be their first holiday without their daughter. Emma had just left for college in the fall, and Kate missed having her around the house. After swinging by the grocery store, Kate arrived home to the cozy 2-story craftsman she shared with Tyler on the outskirts of town. As she walked up to the front door, arms laden with bags, something felt off. The door was ajar, the wood around the lock splintered. Heart pounding, Kate rushed inside. "Tyler," she called out. No answer. Dropping the groceries, she moved through the silent first floor. In the kitchen, signs of a struggle. A broken plate on the floor, utensils scattered across the granite countertop. With rising panic, Kate dashed upstairs. "Tyler, are you here?" Only ominous quiet. Reaching their bedroom, she froze. Tyler lay on the floor, eyes closed, a bullet hole oozing blood on his temple. Kate's legs buckled as she screamed her husband's name over and over. He couldn't be gone, not like this. Sobbing, she hardly noticed the dark figure emerging from the shadows behind her. Not until the cold barrel of a gun pressed against the back of her skull. Then, a flash of searing pain and darkness. Chapter 2: The Scene of the Crime. Police Chief Casey Jensen pulled up to the Burrows residence, the neighborhood cast in the red and blue flash of patrol lights. Steeling herself, she exited the car and approached the front steps. She nodded to the deputy guarding the door. "Chief," he said grimly, lifting the crime scene tape for her to duck under. In the foyer, signs of forced entry were clear. Boot prints and blood smears marred the hardwood floors. Jensen's jaw tightened. In her 10 years as chief, Harverton had seen little violent crime. Until now. She found the bodies in the master bedroom. Tyler Burrows lay by the door, a single gunshot to the head. On the bed, Kate Burrows stared vacantly at the ceiling, a bullet hole between her eyes. The killer had shot her execution style. Jensen cursed under her breath. Kate was well-liked around town, an active volunteer who led the high school poetry club. Who would want her dead? Detective Powell, Jensen's second-in-command, looked up from examining the bedside table. His grim expression said it all. Jensen knew this case would be a tough one to crack. After overseeing the crime scene investigation, Jensen returned to the station. She avoided the wary gazes of her officers, retreating into her office and closing the door. Alone, she allowed the mask of composure to crack. Tears burned her eyes as she thought of the senseless brutality of the murders and the grueling case ahead. Jensen had a personal stake in this one. She owed it to Kate to find the killer, no matter how many sleepless nights it took. Chapter 3: Grief and Speculation. A somber mood cloaked Harverton High in the days after Kate Burroughs' murder. Students spoke in hushed tones between classes, some with eyes rimmed red from crying. Teachers conducted lessons half-heartedly, minds weighed down by the tragic loss of a beloved colleague. Emma Burroughs sat numbly in the back row of her calculus class, unable to focus. She kept replaying her last conversation with her mother about bringing home leftover pumpkin pie for Thanksgiving break. Now there would be no Thanksgiving at all. At lunch period, Emma picked at her food while friends offered awkward words of comfort. Their pitying looks made her skin crawl. She just wanted everyone to stop staring, to leave her alone with the ragged hole her mother's death had torn inside her. In the teacher's lounge, huddled conversations centered on the Burroughs case. Most speculated Tyler had been the real target. As a successful accountant, perhaps he was caught up in shady finances that got him killed. Kate's involvement troubled them most. Had she just been collateral damage, or did the killer have a vendetta against her too? Until the police uncovered more leads, only grim speculation filled the void left by her shocking murder. Around town, rumors circulated like the bitter autumn wind. Some blamed a vagrant squatting on the edge of town, while others were convinced the killer had to be someone local. Fear and mistrust crept through Harverton as residents wondered what darkness lurked behind their white picket fences. For Emma Burroughs, none of the whispers and gossip mattered. She just wanted her mom back. Staring across the empty dinner table at home, the teen hung her head and sobbed. Chapter 4: The Next Target. The Sunday before Thanksgiving, while families enjoyed the holiday weekend, Colin Hayworth drove home from his job at the lumber mill, looking forward to a quiet night alone. A lifelong bachelor, the 40-year-old lived in a modest cabin on the outskirts of Harverton. Colin liked his solitary lifestyle. With no wife or kids, he could indulge his passion for bird watching, spending weekends hiking the trails around his remote home watching for rare species. The simple joys of nature were all he needed. Pulling up to the cabin as dusk fell, Colin thought about the cornbread muffins he'd baked that morning. After dinner, he'd settle into his leather armchair by the fire with a muffin and a latest issue of Birds of the Northeast. Inside, Colin went through his usual ritual. He washed up, changed into comfortable clothes, and poured a glass of whiskey. As he took his first sip, a floorboard creaked behind him. Colin started to turn, just as a crushing force slammed into the back of his skull. Colin's limp body sprawled across the living room floor as blood pooled around his shattered head. Standing over him, the killer hefted a blood-spattered sledgehammer, observing the grisly scene with detached satisfaction. This pathetic loner getting buzzed on whiskey and reading a birding magazine was just the type of lifestyle to punish. Stepping over Colin's body, the killer carried out the next stage of the night's gruesome work. Once finished, the dark figure slipped away into the woods behind the cabin. The next morning, 2 hikers came across a macabre display near the trailhead. Colin Hayworth was propped on his knees, nailed to a tree through his palms. His head lolled to one side, the back of his skull caved in and oozing blood. Around his neck hung a cardboard sign scrawled with the words, "This loner died for HIS sins. WHO's next." Chapter 5: Escalating Fear. Harverton residents awoke Monday morning to the shocking news of Colin Hayworth's murder. As details emerged, widespread panic gripped the town. Clearly, this was no ordinary killing, but the work of a violently deranged mind. At the police station, Chief Jensen observed the controlled chaos as her officers hurried about, following up on leads. Men and women who rarely encountered more than the occasional petty theft were now investigating serial murder. She wished she could offer them some reassurance, but the truth was they were far out of their depth. Jensen's phone rang. It was Emma Burrows, sobbing that she couldn't bear going to school today. "Everyone keeps staring at me," the teen cried. "It's too much." Jensen's heart ached for her. She promised to call the principal and asked that Emma be excused for a few days. After hanging up, Jensen surveyed the crowded bullpen, officers barking into phones and typing up reports. She retreated into her office, shoulders slumped. With 2 locals brutally murdered, fear was metastasizing into mass hysteria. And the Thanksgiving holiday hadn't even begun. Jensen checked her email. The criminal profiler she'd requested from the state police wrote that he could be in Harverton by tomorrow afternoon. Finally, some hope. If anyone could help her get inside this twisted killer's head, it was Special Agent David Ruiz. She wrote back immediately to approve his visit. If Ruiz couldn't stop the bleeding, Jensen feared violence would tear Harverton apart. She gazed out her office window at the quaint town square, flags flapping in the cold wind. A fear deeper than she'd ever known gripped her heart. This was only the beginning. Chapter 6: Blood on Black Friday. Black Friday descended on Harverton Mall in a frenzy of garish decorations, thrumming pop music and frantic shoppers. Teenager Walter Mills wandered wide-eyed through the feverish crowds, unsure where to start. His mom had given him a modest budget, hoping to distract him from the gloom permeating town since the murders. Walter's buddy Tom Harris waved him over to the food court. "Dude, check it out." Tom opened his jacket to show a bottle of vodka secreted away inside. "I snatched it from my dad's cabinet. Let's make this Black Friday lit." Walter shook his head. "I dunno, man. Should we really?" "Come on." Tom laughed. "A couple shots will take the edge off. Then I want to hit the electronics store. My parents promised me a PS5 if I get good grades this quarter." Despite his unease, Walter found himself following Tom's lead. After a few swigs of burning vodka, his head pleasantly fuzzy, the boys weaved into the throngs of shoppers. They passed people overloaded with shopping bags, arguing over sale items, harassing haggard employees to check stock in the back. Walter's good mood curdled. Was this what the holidays were all about? Near the video game store, the crowd bottlenecked. Angry shouts echoed as shoppers vied for position. Walter froze up, his breath quickening. "Tom, I don't like this, can we go?" "Bro, chill, I just have to get." Tom trailed off as the shoving escalated into full-blown violence. Someone threw a punch. Screams erupted. The mob dissolved into mass brawling. Walter screamed as he lost sight of Tom in the chaos. Suddenly, fiery pain erupted in his ribs as he was kicked to the floor. Curled in a ball, blows rained down on him from all sides. As Walter faded into blackness, the last thing he heard was Tom's panicked voice crying out his name. Chapter 7: Racing the Killer. On Saturday, Chief Jensen deployed every available officer to maintain order and investigate the Black Friday riot. The violence had left dozens injured, with teenager Walter Mills the sole fatality. It was a new low for Harverton. Jensen coordinated door-to-door interviews around the mall, searching for riot witnesses. She hoped to ID Walter's attackers quickly and stem further vigilantism. A voice called out from the parking lot. David Ruiz strode toward Jensen, leather jacket and short salt and pepper beard, giving him a roguish look belying his analytical mind. "Chief, we need to talk," he said. "The killings and this riot are connected." Back at the station, Ruiz elaborated on his theory. This riot was orchestrated by the killer to further terrorize the town, while providing cover for his next murder. Jensen's eyes widened. "You think the killer is using the rioters as scapegoats?" "It's likely," Ruiz said. "He whipped that crowd into a murderous frenzy, then selected a vulnerable victim." Jensen considered the profiler's bold claim. As insane as it seemed, she shared his suspicion that a cunning predator lurked beneath this spree of violence. She turned to Ruiz. "If you're right, he'll kill again soon. We need to get inside this bastard's head. How does he select victims? How can we predict his next target?" Ruiz nodded, his expression grave. "I have several theories. Let's get to work before he takes more lives." They dove into the case files, searching for the hidden threads uniting the victims. Both knew every minute mattered now. Each passing Thanksgiving brought them closer to the killers in game. Chapter 8: A Mother's Anguish. Darlene Mills sat staring at the phone, willing it to ring with word of an arrest, some explanation for the senseless murder of her son. Instead, an awful void greeted her in the dark, empty house. It was Thanksgiving morning, not that the date mattered anymore. Darlene's family always volunteered at the soup kitchen before gathering for dinner. She used to love the holiday bustle, greeting familiar faces and filling bellies with turkey and fixings. Now it just felt hollow. Walter should be sleeping off a plateful of leftovers right now, belly full and smile content. Instead, he was cold in the ground, buried 2 days ago after an overflow crowd packed the church for his funeral. Darlene sobbed through eulogies from Walter's teachers, friends, herself. None captured the boundless spirit extinguished brutally on some dingy mall floor. Now here she sat, eyes burning from crying, clinging to some feeble hope. She just needed Sheriff Jensen to say the words, "We got him." Instead, the phone mockingly silent, as if no one cared her whole world had collapsed. Darlene gazed through the window at the tranquil street. Kids rode bikes, fathers washed cars, normal lives going on obliviously. Meanwhile, she was trapped in agonizing limbo. Rising from the couch, Darlene shuffled to the liquor cabinet and poured herself a vodka. She tipped it back, embracing the searing in her throat, tears flowing again. Today was meant for giving thanks. But for Darlene Mills, there was nothing left to be thankful for. Chapter 9: A Killers Manifesto. On Thanksgiving evening, 2 patrol cars pulled up to the Fowler residence on Elm Street, responding to reports of gunfire. Inside, they came upon a bloodbath. The Fowler family, Doug and Amy, along with teenage son Sean, 12-year-old daughter Haley, and 8-year-old Christopher, all executed methodically with shots to the head. At the station, Jensen examined the ghastly crime scene photos, struggling to remain composed. She had expected the killer to strike again, but nothing could prepare her for such depraved savagery. Slaughtering an entire family on Thanksgiving? She was dealing with pure evil. One detail in particular unsettled Jensen. A large cardboard sign had been carefully propped on the dining room table. Across it was scrawled a disturbing manifesto. "You sought to celebrate gluttony. Now you die in hell." Jensen met Ruiz's eyes. He's trying to justify these murders. Sick morality is part of his psychosis. Ruiz agreed. This gives us insight into his mind. He punishes sins like greed and gluttony, In his view, he's performing a service by eliminating them. Jensen sighed. So he won't stop. Who knows what innocents he'll target next for his twisted judgments? She studied the Fowler family portrait below the manifesto. Smiling faces frozen in happier times, oblivious of the horror awaiting them. Jensen silently renewed her vow. No matter how long it took, she would decipher this madman's code and bring him to justice. Chapter 10, Christmas Bleak. December brought a somber, tense mood to Harverton as families approached the Christmas season with reluctance and dread. Usually the charming main street twinkled with lights as carolers filled the air with song. Now only a handful of muted decorations broke the gloom, and snow fell silently on empty sidewalks. At the police station, an oppressive cloud hung over the task force. Leads were scarce, the killer's next move frustratingly opaque. For Chief Jensen, the aborted holiday only exacerbated the chilling isolation of her obsession. Late one night, Jensen sat brooding in her office when a knock interrupted her spiraling thoughts. She looked up as Deputy Powell entered. He studied her with concern in his eyes. "How are you holding up?" he asked gently. Jensen stiffened. She didn't need sympathy or sentimentality. "I'm fine," she said briskly. "Just reviewing the case files for any connections." Powell frowned. "With all due respect, Chief, you're running yourself into the ground on this case. When was the last time you slept or saw your family?" Anger flashed in Jensen. She didn't have time for coddling. Lives were on the line. "I'll rest when this bastard's behind bars or dead," she snapped. Powell raised his hands in a conciliatory gesture. "No need to bite my head off. I'm just looking out for you." He turned to go, shaking his head sadly. Alone again, Jensen felt a pang of remorse. She knew Powell meant well by checking on her, but she couldn't let anything deter her from stopping this monster. With a heavy sigh, Jensen dug back into the gruesome case files, more alone than ever. Chapter 11, Profiler Problems. On the Sunday before Christmas, Jensen and Ruiz sat in her office, butting heads over coffee. "We're missing something," Ruiz insisted. "The intervals between his killings are accelerating. He's building toward a climax." Jensen threw up her hands in frustration. "I know the timeline, but we have nothing concrete on his next target. Should we just lock down the whole damn town?" Ruiz bristled. "There's no need for hysterics. We just have to stay calm and think logically." Jensen scoffed. "Don't patronize me, you waltz in with your fancy psychobabble, but we're no closer to stopping him. Meanwhile, the body count rises." "I understand your frustration, Chief, but you're letting it cloud your judgment." Jensen stood abruptly, hands planted on her desk as she leaned toward Ruiz. "Don't tell me how to do my job. My officers are riddled with doubt, and I'm the only one holding this investigation together." Ruiz held her fiery gaze, keeping his voice level. "With all due respect, I've hunted monsters like this for years. You brought me on to get inside his mind, and that's what I intend to do. But we have to work together." Jensen stared him down a moment longer before sinking back into her chair with a defeated sigh. As much as she hated to admit it, she needed Ruiz and his expertise. "You're right," she conceded. "This bastard is just preying on my obsession to catch him. I can't let him bait me into making mistakes." Ruiz gave an approving nod. "Trust me, we'll find his weakness. When predators become this emboldened, They get sloppy. He leaned forward with a knowing gleam in his eye. And when he slips up, we'll be there to snare him. Chapter 12. Holiday Horror. Christmas morning broke bitterly cold over Harverton, a pale sun peering through snow-heavy clouds. Most residents remained sequestered behind locked doors rather than venturing out to visit family. Only on Main Street did some brave souls emerge to attend Christmas Mass, clinging to religious tradition even in a time of fear. Among them was Emma Burrows, accompanied by her father's sister, her only remaining family. Bundled in a wool coat and hat, Emma stared numbly at the snowy sidewalk, ignoring the festive wreaths and garlands decorating the church. She used to love Christmas as a child, bounding downstairs to see the cookies left out for Santa. But this year, there was no joy left, only grief and dread coiled in her gut. Inside the sanctuary, Emma sat numbly through the service, unable to focus on the organ hymns or the priest's impassioned reading of the nativity story. She flinched as those around her rose and began exchanging handshakes and hugs, wishing peace and joy. The hollow greetings blurred into a cacophony of denial. How could there be tidings of comfort and joy when her mother's killer was still free? Emma hurried outside after the service, the forced Christmas spirit cloying. As she moved down the sidewalk past festive storefronts, the red and green blurring through tears, she heard Aunt Jean call out behind her. Emma quickened her pace, arms hugged around herself. She just wanted this Christmas to be over. Suddenly, Emma realized the sidewalk around her was deserted. An eerie silence had fallen over Main Street. Squinting down the snowy road through her tears, she glimpsed two silhouettes beneath the gabled roof of the town courthouse, half a block away. Heart freezing, Emma stopped dead. This was no Christmas miracle. The killer had come to church, and he'd left a twisted gift beneath the town Christmas tree. Chapter 13. Losing Control. By noon on Christmas Day, word had spread of the sadistic display under the courthouse Christmas tree. In the icy town square, Jensen surveyed the scene by the twinkling lights of the 30-foot evergreen. At the base of the tree lay a large cardboard sign, scrawled with the killer's usual verbose justification. This ungrateful brat embraced materialism, not the true meaning of Christmas. Spread-eagled atop the sign was the bloody, mutilated body of a teenager, identified already as a boy who'd gotten in trouble vandalizing a store with graffiti last year. He'd been cruelly impaled through the hands and feet with thick decorative candy canes that pinned his body to the sign like some grotesque crucifixion. As her officers swarmed the scene, Jensen turned away, swallowing the bile rising in her throat. She'd underestimated this monster's cunning and depravity. He killed at will now, always one step ahead, toying with her futile investigation. And innocent blood was the cost. That afternoon, she informed Ruiz she was implementing a curfew and increased checkpoints around town to monitor all movement. He nodded reluctantly. I know you're feeling pressure to act, but punitive measures could backfire. Chief, curfews create prisons in people's minds. We need them alert, not cowering in their homes. Jensen glared. The time for analytical restraint is over. If you can't handle getting your hands dirty, I'll find someone who can. She stormed off, leaving Ruiz staring after her worriedly. In her office, Jensen barked orders to deploy more officers for curfew patrols and mandatory stop-and-search traffic checkpoints. Harverton was now under de facto martial law. It pained Jensen, but she refused to let Christmas become a massacre on her watch. The killer had finally forced her hand. She only prayed it wouldn't cost more innocent lives. Chapter 14. Cabin in the Woods. On a snowy ridge high above Harverton, a secluded log cabin was lit against the gloom of winter twilight. Inside, a fire crackled in a stone hearth as the killer prepared for the night's work. Carefully, reverently, he laid his tools on a cloth spread before the fireplace. A hunting knife with a cruel serrated edge, coiled nylon rope, a leather sap glove studded with lead balls. Items for restraining, silencing, correcting. Soon he would embark under cover of darkness to continue his vital mission. Cleansing the town of its undesirables required meticulous selection of targets, always seeking out deeper corruption festering beneath the surface. In his crusade, he had come to realize one especially nasty root of evil poisoning Harverton. Chief Jensen, with her smug sense of authority. Her feudal rules only enabled the town's worst offenders. Tonight, he would teach her that lesson in blood. Show her what true justice required. And maybe finally she would understand. The killer lifted the hunting knife, turning it before the firelight. He imagined it sliding into Jensen's corrupt flesh, awakening her to the truth. Soon, he thought, patience and care were required. For now, smaller game awaited him below. Minor offenders, but symbols of the wider decay. Nipping at the branches spread the rot. Soon he would administer appropriate justice. Then they would all see. Smiling faintly, the killer rose and donned his killing coat. Darkness was falling. Chapter 15. Cabin Compromised. A week after Christmas, Sheriff Jensen sat across from Ruiz at a corner booth in Mama's Diner, picking at a plate of runny eggs and limp bacon. She should have been back at the station coordinating door-to-door inquiries with the latest victims' neighbors. Instead, here she was, entertaining the profiler's quixotic theories. "You really think your cabin theory is the breakthrough we've been waiting for?" Jensen asked dubiously. Ruiz nodded, leaning over his black coffee. The layered clothing fibers from the last two victims indicate exposure to a rugged outdoor setting, and the intermittent availability pattern suggests a remote secondary location. Jensen's skepticism must have shown on her face, because Ruiz gave her a wry smile. "Look, I know it seems thin, but my gut tells me this unsub has a secluded place where he prepares. If we find it, we gain major insight into his methods and psychology." Jensen had to admit Ruiz's reasoning made a certain sense, and they had precious few leads right now. She nodded firmly. "All right, I'll get a team assembled to search remote structures. We'll start." "Anonymous tip for you folks." Jensen scowled as Deputy Samuelson interrupted, leaning over their booth. "Unless it involves the killer, it can wait." Samuelson's face was grim. Tips said they spotted a loner, Colin Frears, with a truck full of tools and bleach up a remote driveway. Could be our guy. Jensen exchanged an urgent look with Ruiz. She quickly threw some cash on the table. "Looks like we'd better check out that cabin." Chapter 16. The trap is set. From the dense tree line, the killer watched through binoculars as police vehicles crept up the snowy access road toward his cabin retreat. His pulse quickened, but he forced himself to remain calm, remembering his emergency contingency plan. After all, he'd known this day would come eventually. Chief Jensen was a persistent bloodhound sniffing ever closer to his sanctuary. But she underestimated his cunning. Lowering the binoculars, the killer allowed himself a thin smile. Jensen thought she had found the wolf's den. In truth, he had led her into a trap. Soon deputies were swarming the yard around the cabin, Jensen leading the way with gun drawn. At her signal, they breached the door, pouring inside the dark interior. Mere moments later, Jensen re-emerged, signaling an all clear. From the woods, the killer watched her shadowed expression as she examined the contents of his workshop. The implications were dawning on her. She was chasing a ghost. He imagined her real. Chapter 18, Dark Christmas. On Christmas Eve 1 year earlier, Dr. Nicholas Holden's wife and daughters were driving home from visiting family, taking a remote county highway through dense woods. Snow was falling heavily, the road dark. Somewhere along that lonely stretch, another vehicle suddenly barreled out from a hidden driveway. The cars collided head-on. By the time police arrived, called by a passing trucker, it was too late. Holden's entire family had perished. With them died Holden's faith in justice. Authorities filed it as a tragic accident, the remorseful other driver not even charged. Where was the punishment for such careless evil? In his all-consuming grief, Holden found clarity. If law and morality failed, vengeance must suffice. So he withdrew from his psychiatric practice, severing all ties to distract from his new purpose. In a secluded cabin, he honed the physical and mental skills to become an avenging shadow. Patience was essential. His design required years to enact. The cycle of violence plaguing Harverton had been masterfully orchestrated. Holden manipulated riots and fear, seeding brutality in a hungry public psyche. Soon they would understand he brought necessary retribution. Chief Jensen was an unforeseen complication. Her competence and stubborn morality threatened his design, so he adapted the plan to exploit her pride and tenacity. And now, the endgame approached. Events were aligning, just as Holden envisioned so long ago. The killer they desperately hunted lived inside his own shattered mind, feeding endlessly on a cycle of loss and rage, until every sinner in Harverton atoned in blood. Chapter 19, Christmas Darkness Falls. On Christmas Eve, as families tucked children into bed for sugar-plum dreams, final preparations were made in secret places across Harverton. In one home, a mother sobbed and pleaded into the phone while a grim deputy checked his weapon. In another, a father clutched his weeping wife, their doors bolted, a shotgun across his knees. And miles away, on an isolated ridge, veiled in snow and darkness, Dr. Holden stood over his table of terrible instruments. The time had come to end this. To his victims, he was the Thanksgiving killer, a faceless specter of judgment. Tonight, he would reveal himself to Jensen as flesh and blood, as helpless as the wife and daughters she failed to protect. Only then would this broken cycle find resolution. Holden knew he would likely die tonight. He welcomed it. Since his family perished, each breath was agony. Unleashing vengeance had given him purpose, but no peace awaited. Perhaps in death, he would find the escape that life denied. Holden lifted the black tactical mask from the table, turning it in gloved hands. Dark, empty eyes gazed back. He slid the mask over his face, casting himself as nothing more than an instrument of justice. Then he stepped into the frigid darkness, waiting outside the cabin door. It was time for Chief Jensen to face judgment for her sins, and for Holden to fulfill his final duty as the Thanksgiving killer. Chapter 20, Sacrifice. Jensen sat alone in the dark living room of her sister's house, watching the snowfall outside. She had slipped away here for a few days, heeding Samuelson's advice to lay low while patrols guarded her home. But she felt no safer removed from the looming threat. Upstairs, Jensen's sister Claire and 9-year-old niece Kimmy slept, unaware of the horror aimed their way. While Jensen hid down here, helpless and alone, she blinked away useless tears. A deafening crash jarred Jensen to her feet. The front door exploded inward, knocked off its hinges by a single powerful kick. Heart seizing, Jensen fumbled for the 9mm pistol tucked in her waistband, just as the attacker rushed inside. The black tactical mask and hood obscured his face, but Jensen knew it was him, the Thanksgiving killer come to fulfill his twisted promise. She raised the pistol, but too late. The killer's gloved fist swung, colliding with her temple in an explosion of pain and light. Jensen's limp body crumpled to the floor. Helpless, fading into darkness, she heard his heavy footsteps on the stairs stalking toward her sister's family. When Jensen came to, she was bound to a chair in the living room, her sister and niece bound and gagged on the couch. Before her loomed the killer's imposing black form. "Why?" Jensen whispered through cracked lips. The killer regarded her coldly. "To remind you that truth requires sacrifice." He turned, drawing a gleaming knife. "Don't fret, your loved ones' deaths will serve the greater good." "Take me!" Jensen screamed desperately. "Leave them be, I'm guilty, not them, please." The killer paused, then gave one curt nod. "So be it." He cut her bonds, dragged her roughly to her feet. With his knife at her back, Jensen walked silently into the snowy darkness, leaving her family behind. She did not look back. Whatever fate awaited, she embraced it. Their lives were hers. This was the sacrifice demanded to end his twisted crusade. She prayed it would be enough. Chapter 21: The Cleansing Fire. The killer forced Jensen through the snowy woods into the mountains. They climbed for hours until the trees thinned, giving way to rocky ridges. A lone cabin waited, windows glowing ominously. Inside, Jensen was restrained to a chair while her captor gathered items around the room. Kerosene to douse the walls and furniture. Rope and handcuffs to bind her permanently. The curved knife to peel away her mask of flesh. "Why are you doing this?" Jensen asked. "What drives your cruelty?" The killer turned, eyes dark pools behind his mask. "You still don't see I cleanse sickness. My family was butchered by your willful blindness." Jensen's stomach turned as understanding hit her. "You lost loved ones, and it destroyed you." The killer slammed his fist on the table. "I was ruined, but the guilty carry on oblivious, so I became the cure." He stepped toward Jensen, knife gleaming. "The only mercy is to excise the rot, whatever the cost." Jensen saw the gnarled roots, feeding his anger. "Your family would be heartbroken to see you this way. Ending more lives won't heal you, only spread the pain." The killer faltered, a shadow of doubt flickering across his eyes. Jensen seized the opportunity. "You've suffered enough. Give me the knife and end this cycle. It's time to cast off vengeance and be free." For endless moments they remained frozen, the killer poised over Jensen, gripping the knife in a trembling fist. Then slowly he knelt before her, head bowed in crippling grief. "My wife's face haunts me in darkness," he whispered. "I can't endure it any longer." Jensen exhaled in deep relief as he surrendered the knife. Your family is waiting for you now. It's time to leave this pain behind. There are good people here who will help you heal. The killer lifted his head to reveal his glistening eyes. Dr. Nicholas Holden gazed back at her, the mask finally cast off. Forgive me, he sobbed. Jensen took Holden's hands in compassion. I do. Now come. Let us walk into the light. As dawn's first light filtered through the cabin window, for the first time in long, blood-stained years, there was hope of redemption. The long nightmare had ended. Epilogue. Winter's gloom slowly lifted from Harverton as news spread the killer had been captured and confessed. Families emerged from the pall of fear to share tentative smiles in the park and gather for long-awaited celebrations. On a bright spring day scented with blossoms, the community united for a memorial honoring all the lives lost to violence. Chief Jensen watched from the stage as people embraced and wept, the collective spirit of Harverton reborn. There was still much healing ahead, wounds too deep to erase overnight. But as doves were released into the cloudless sky, Jensen knew the town would persevere, bound by hope and compassion. Darkness had tested them, but it had not prevailed. Gazing out over the streets she had sworn to protect, Jensen's heart swelled with renewed purpose. She would help guide Harverton into better days, serving with humility and justice. The road ahead promised light as long as the people walked it together. The end.